Dear Mayores of Canet, dear friends of the working group, dear attendants, welcome and good evening. Restoring entails a technical process by which you refurbish or you renew a given building. This very seminar is devoted to restoration. So how come a historian is speaking about restoration? You can indeed restore a physical element, which is what we are used to, but we need to incorporate the restoration of landscape, of memory, of anything that contributes to try and provide this information, insights about the past. Indeed, in Canet back in the 1990s, there was quite a transformation of the city center. Canet during the 1990s had some 8,000 residents, where we now have almost twice as much, and was going through a very complex situation of being deindustrialized. Canet had been a major industrial hub where it turned SOC into sort of an empire, but yet by the late 80s they lost their push, and so they went through a dire situation with high rate of unemployment, and therefore this transformation of the landscape started back then. First of all, because it brought the possibility to acquire, to buy some buildings by the city council, but also it was on that setting that you could reassess, reevaluate the heritage of Domènech Montaner's buildings, where they have many buildings. First of all, because Domènech Montaner is related to this town because of family matters. His mother had been born there. His wife was also from Canet de Mar, and therefore Domènech Montaner was going there during the summer without even being asked, because they were the ones that were asking him to. So on this back and forth during the summer holidays from him, you can see all these different types of buildings popping up. Most of the buildings that he designed were buildings based on previous structures of older buildings. So Domènech Montaner, one could say that it was only the Casa Roura that designed, whereas the rest of the buildings were transformations based on previous buildings, considering how the major trade craft took place. And so on these historical buildings, he transformed a series of projects. We will look specifically into these three: the Ateneu de Canet Cultural Center, the Can Rocós and Can Domènech houses. First of all, because they are publicly owned by the city council, but we will also look into the Casa Roura house, which, still being a private design, yet contributed to the transformation of the urban landscape in Canet de Mar. Just to give you a quick setting on Canet de Mar from a bird's view, you can see that in just a few hundred meters you have most of the Domènech Montaner's heritage. And this is the Saint-Domingue river, not because of Domènech Montaner, the name was in there before him. And you know that often we face, in the case of major rainfall, major floods, and we have the Buscarons and Gavara rivers merging into this Saint-Domingue river. So in this place is where, in this very small space, is where you find most of his buildings. First of all, the Ateneu Cultural Center, that was built between 1884 and 1885, and also Can Rocós, which is a townhouse on houses that date back to the 16th, 17th century, where the redesign took place on 1904, 1906. Then we have Casa Domènech house, the merging of two smaller houses in the 18th century that were redesigned in 1918 and 1919, and finally Casa Roura house, which is a new design that took place between 1891 and 1892. In this small area with such a major heritage, you can see three different of his periods. Even though these are minor buildings, we are not talking about the top of his buildings or the most recognized of his buildings, yet you can see the different periods he went through. From the very first experimental or eclectic period, where he designed the Ateneo de Canet Cultural Center, and this is way before the World's Fair. On that specific period, on the World's Fair, we have the Casa Roura house, and then we have some late period, the Casa Domènech house, which was built when the Catalan Art Nouveau, the Catalan Modernism, was almost a memory fading away. Yet it was based on two previous smaller buildings from 18th century, and it was to be his house in his later years. Within this context of crisis in Canet, there was a change in the mayor, and in 1987, Josep Rovira became the mayor. He was 65 back then, precisely at the time when people think about retiring, and yet he devoted himself to politics. He had been, before that, the president of a sort of a tourism association in Canet de Mar. He had been a hotel owner, he had been a cultural promoter, he had founded the Canetum publishing company at Canet, he had also headed the Plaça de la Llenya magazine, so he was someone that he really was well acquainted with the landscape, with the potentialities, but also with the lacks and wants. He knew what could be done and could be not done, and he was well aware of the precarious situation, financially speaking, on many households. So the first thing he would try was to try and draw on these potentialities based on the heritage. And in 1987, even though Barcelona was already well on his way to becoming such a landmark place, Canet was somehow forgotten. And yet Mr. Rovira went on to revitalizing modernism, and with this type of a logo, which was quite bold back then, by stating that Canet was a Catalan, or the Catalan modernist village. And even though money was lacking back then, he had to go through a whole restoration quest of buildings that were dirty and in full decay. The previous mayors had not been able to transform or restore many of the buildings that, even though publicly owned, yet nothing was done on them. So based on this motto, based on this slogan, Mr. Rovira tried to find some solutions on this issue, and he started on with the Canet Cultural Center, the Ateneo. And this was right after its design, after its building, highly symmetrical, highly academic, one might say, and yet including all elements in the Catalan modernism, with this graffito, with the iron works, and it was definitely a building that would shine. It was well in the middle of these two streams in Canet, and yet, as you can see, in 1977, most elements that were the graffitos had been torn away, some of them being vandalized after the Spanish Civil War, so it was well worn down. And so when the city council decided to buy this building, they did so with a symbolic price, because it was close to being demolished. You could not reuse it, and no one could enter it because of the structural issues. The building was bought in 1983 by the city council, not the Mr. Rovira, but the previous mayor, Mr. Cruañas, and once bought, they aimed at transforming it into a city theatre. And the rehabilitation project started in 1985 with some news breaking on that time. But when in 1987 Mr. Rovira became the mayor of Canet, he decided to go for a change. And instead of a city theatre, he wanted to have a library on it. He was quite smart because he knew the funds were lacking. And so by turning this into a library, since this would be owned by the provincial council, he would get some extra funds. The rehabilitation project was done by Per Armadas first, and then Joan and Domènech Borràs later. He was a nephew to Mr. Domènech Montaner, and through 7 different stages down until 1999, this was transformed and recovered. He was well aware that this was a work that would take place for many years, like many of these type of restorations that need to be done step by step, little by little. So these were indeed 7 stages that people had to suffer through. But Mr. Rovira, first, he tried to consolidate the building, so it was brought down the interior, and once he had the box, a 3rd stage was to try and leave us in the waiting room. What do I mean by this? I mean that he would go through the recovery, not the restoration, of the facade with this graffito, or this limes graffito, that he was wise enough to outsourced to a company that's still existing, I think, the Pipsa company, that was under the technical management of Joan Millas, that did a very thorough recovery work, even though there were some mistakes, but we're talking about some decades ago. And here you can see the final result. Nothing was in it. It was just a box, and you had to wait for many years until the final library was moved in here. This picture was like the starting point for this recovery on Lluís Domènech Montaner heritage. And it was a building that everyone was well aware of but was not looking at because it was ugly, yet the media realized about the goals set by this mayor that wanted indeed to, according to him, to compete against Barcelona. But sometimes these bold headlines give you some extra dissemination value. Well, Mr. Rovira was quite a provocateur himself, so he managed to bring about these headlines, and so let's try and become rivals to the Golden Block in Barcelona. But he kind of found his way. So he told how he met with Mr. Nadal, the then mayor of Girona, because there was a school of arts and crafts there, and that was good to them because there was much heritage to be renewed, and so not through the ERDFs but through different type of funds, together with some other type of subsidies that were brought by the Spanish organization. Mr. Rovira found this as a kind of economical way to fix these torn down buildings, but also by providing jobs to the unemployed young people in Canet that were facing the outcome of deindustrialization. So we had many vocational schools. First one was Escola Vilaflor School, and they were all created under these aims. And I think that you also worked on Pyramata and Canet. We led this type of vocational schools, I would say, out of necessity. If we wanted to have restoration moving on, if we wanted to have our heritage kept, we had to we needed to have these professional restorers that, along with their students, would make this possible. You can see this rose window and how it is restored. You can see how in through the woodwork everything is recovered, and how the glasses are being supported and everything made from anew because nothing had been left. Out of the very few samples that had been kept, some similar elements were tried to find, and now we see this type of windwheel that was recovered. Also, the iron, the original iron, as you can see in this cutout sheet that Domènech Montaner would use in many of his buildings, and out of cautiousness, the original iron works were replaced by these new ones created by the smiths, by the new blacksmiths. Now let's look onto a different building, the Can Rocosa house. Can Rocosa was the house that Domènech Montaner would use as a workshop, knowing that he would live in Canet for a while and he would live in Barcelona for a while. So whenever he was in Canet, his workshop, his atelier was at Can Rocosa. 1 million, so roughly 6,000 euros, was the symbolic price that the City Council of Canet had to pay to acquire, and it was done even through 2 different stages, just under 6,000 euros. So that goes to show how in lack they were, in financial lack. And this was not a farmer's house, it was indeed a townhouse, but they wanted this to become a museum devoted to Domènech Montaner. And Mr. Rovira would say that you can have a museum from him anywhere, but you can only have a house of his in Canet because that's his house, and you can see him like breathing there. And it was in a very poor condition, as you can see in the facade, even though the interior it was even worse in structurally speaking. And there was the Villa Flor school that led these, along with Canet Moderniste school, that brought the restoration of the whole house and to transform it into museum. You can see how they are layering the facade, or the flooring in the first floor had collapsed, and here they are rebuilding the left wing of the house. Also, the flooring in the attic between the first and the second floor was to be rebuilt. The carpentry was also torn down. Any beams that could be recovered, the ones that you can still see now, are as originally brought by Domènech Montaner, and anything that could not be recovered was replaced by new carpentry. And you can see this picture of the facade, and later this museum was inaugurated. And even though the starting point was the Ateneo, you now have this building as a way to disseminate his heritage, his legacy in Canet de Mar. Mr. Rovira could not stop thinking about new ideas. You can see, even in this right article, how he's thinking about a center about documenting modernism. He was well ahead of his time in how he wanted to recover Catalan modernism in Catalonia, but he was well ahead in that he wanted to recover the documents, the archives. So it was not only the building, the house, but also the memory behind them. So he wanted to create a research center, a center for studies, but also having a specific place in the Rocosa house for an archive. Yet he went. He was so bold as to even think behind that. And Can Rocosa, I've always claimed that it was already a museum before becoming a true museum, because Can Rocosa would hold all the pieces and objects that Mr. Domènech and Montaner would have in his projects. Some new interventions have taken place in 2007. The whole roof was replaced, and in 2008, part of the flooring that had not been replaced in the first works had to be. So Can Rocosa was another major landmark in this job to recover the Catalan modernism in Canet. And in 2004, Mayor Rovira wants to extend the Can Rocosa by creating an archive, a documentary center in a single building. And Can Domènech House was designed by Domènech Montaner in his late life, along with Francis Guardi and his son. And this building had been bought by a bank in 1979, and in between the two buildings there was the bank office, the branch. And this would be as a hindrance to on what Rovira was looking at. But yet he even managed to convince the bank to leave this branch, to leave this office, so that on the ground floor he could have this archive, this research center for Domènech Montaner. Here you can see the house. Again, it was ugly and it was worn down. You can see there was a very small intervention done, but the major intervention came after it was acquired by the city council and a major renovation was undertaken. It was at this time the Canetum workshop, or the Canetum vocational school, that would take this work. And between 94 and 95, and the students, the restorers, the teachers would reset the space, would upgrade it in this major work as required, as you can see, because the bank had done nothing there. And here you can see the outcome after the work done by this vocational workshop under the lead of the city officials. And in 2005, 2006, there has been also a major intervention. First, a column in the gallery, which is landmark in the house, and the whole gallery had to be replaced in order to, and it was rebuilt once again in order to remove its pathologies. And from Can Rocosa, another house, but let me say that in 1999, when one would think that the archive, the documentary center, could start working, there was enough information available, there were talks with Domènech Montaner's estate, but yet in 1999 Mr. Rovira lost the elections, almost with no representation, so this project was brought to a halt. And since this was quite a personal project, a pet project of him, the new city council decided to stop this, and so Casa Domènech became just an extension of the museum house Can Rocosa. So it doesn't have this cultural contribution that Mr. Rovira wanted to bring to it. Yet, people is now aware that Catalan modernism is here to stay, and therefore these restorations eventually bring people in on what's known as cultural tourism. People realize this, and the people with some private businesses see that they need to do their best out of these. And Casa Roura, that had been a hostel, it later became a restaurant, and in the year 2007 decided to jump onto this restoration bandwagon from a private initiative, and they made a rehabilitation of this building. Casa Roura is quite significant work in what's known as a Catalan modernism summer buildings, and there was a total rehabilitation of the filling of the tower, where you and the slates in the roof tile were falling down, and there was a rebuilding with this new ceiling, with this new roof and new ceramics in order to have the original layout brought. Oh, there was also major rework on the interior, not just done on the woodwork, but also on the ceiling and the flooring. The Marigliano floors that have suffered these hundreds so years of people stepping on them, and also because of the high humidity in Canet. Accordingly, over 30% of the original floor tiles have disappeared, and this is quite a work. It's costly both in hours and in euros, and yet it brought these, as you can see, in the interior of Casa Roura. The floors were restored. There was quite a work done on the ironworks, done by Tiestos. That was one of the blacksmiths that would help Mr. Domènech Montaner in the Castell dels Tres Dragons castle. And Canet, the Catalan village of Catalan modernist village, is, one would say, a blooming period on this hidden modernism in Canet del Mar with an outstanding result. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. And these went along with some new projects. For instance, in 2010, 2011, there was a refurbishment of the museum house Lluís Domènech Montaner, led by the city councillor in charge of cultural affairs, and aiming to transform this inner discourse of Can Rocosa and Can Domènech, and so with an intention to look into this with also some new museum approaches by replacing the usual pictures hanging on the walls by incorporating a more up-to-date discourse that's still valid these days. And also, Rovira's legacy does not stay only until 99. It took some years for some Domènech Montaner enthusiasts to create this research center, following along the lines of Mr. Rovira in wanting to have the Casa Domènech house becoming an archive, a documentary center. That was not possible. And the research center tried to reclaim back this space that Mr. Rovira could not manage to do as a politician, and so we have tried to put Canet back on the map of Domènech's legacy, along with the initiative undertaken by the Domènech Montaner Research Group into a joint effort. Yet we still have much to do, and let me conclude by saying that Rovira was also considering creating that documentation center, and back in the 90s this was mostly seen as physical archives, but now we're speaking about digital archives, and so we can end up creating this documentation center as a more modern center. And so, dear Mayoress, we would like to have you in so that we can complement the legacy of someone that brought something unique to Canet de Mar, and therefore we would like to encourage you into being well aware that Rovira's project has not ended, even though he passed away last year, but we believe we need to continue with his efforts. Domènech Montaner's legacy, both in Canet and elsewhere in Catalonia, is powerful enough so that we can have this type of center, but also being a modern center, where it's not only incorporating all these archives and documentation, but trying to disseminate the projects revolving around Domènech Montaner. We're talking about a lab here, we're talking about a center for the Domènech Montaner's projects, because we believe that it can be something really big. So, dear mayors, if you want to put this forward, you have us on your side. Are there